it is it?
Sorry, I didn't know there's a voice attached.
Okay, I'll just continue.
That's interesting. Maybe that's a new thing they've added so people realize. That's very good, actually.
Well, yeah, but it interrupts you. Anyway, so one of the methods used in the contemporary study of religion is called phenomenology. This method involves a conscious decision on the part of the scholar to not impose his or her modern day interpretations on religious materials that do not share such a viewpoint. That means that in the next 5 classes, I will endeavor to present Sri Aurobindo's writings in as neutral a fashion as I can, doing my best to avoid reductionistic explanations as far as possible. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And here we go. Okay, and so Marie, how about starting us off as number 1 here, please?
Reading 1. Phenomenology concerns itself with representing the claims and beliefs of a religious tradition as accurately and objectively as possible, as phenomena in their own right and within their own context, suspending judgment on issues of truth from the perspective of scientific validity. Edwin Bryant, The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali.
Mhm. So one of the ways I understand phenomenology, which is just a fancy word, is that I want to be able to represent the religion in such a way that a person who happens to hold that religion in close to their heart would agree with my presentation, that I was being accurate. So that requires a certain suspension of my own personal beliefs temporarily, until such time as I'm ready to critique it. Okay. So I'm not going to attempt to purge Aurobindo's texts of their references to various divinities, celestial realms, mystic powers, and so forth. Although such beliefs conflict with current post-Enlightenment rational thought, such conflict, or cognitive dissonance you might call it, may actually provide us with an opportunity to probe and possibly reevaluate our own intellectual and cultural preconceptions and predispositions. I will depart from this strategy only when I come to compare Aurobindo's higher levels of mind with Abdu'l-Baha's stages of the soul in the 9th class. So by way of introducing Aurobindo's thought, I'd like to ask you what you think constitutes the basic building block of the universe. Let's take a couple of minutes or so and see what you would come up with. If somebody asked you that, what would you say about that? Anybody? Nina?
Well, there is a high power, which is God.
Okay. But I'm talking about how is the world of creation constructed? What's the basic unit that is responsible for things being built up into creation? Sylvie.
Lisa has her hand up too, Mark.
Okay, I didn't see that.
Sorry, Sylvie.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Sylvie. I'll come back to Lisa in a second.
The atom, you're talking about the basic building blocks, right?
Yeah.
So the atom, I
Okay.
would say.
Okay. Lisa, what would you say?
I would just have said love.
Okay. How do you construct physical reality out of love, though?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Okay, Alan?
Just a second.
I had an opportunity to take a look at some of the basic physics once, and the basic physics said that the universe is nothing; it doesn't exist. is all there is. What the idea was, and I'm going to have to just be very overarching in this, very simple, is there's matter and there's antimatter, and in the universe they balance each other out, which means that there is nothing when they're balanced appropriately, and that therefore there is nothing in this universe. What occurred at the beginning with the Big Bang is that certain laws were added to the universe. The first law was that of probability, and or perhaps that was the second. The first law may have just been love. It's attraction of like for like, if you will. And that this attraction of like for like led to a situation where at some point in time, given that there was no time, there was a collection of matter that was so large that it was destroyed in a very large explosion, if you will, the Big Bang, that led to a separation of matter and antimatter and the creating of a ripple effect across the universe of this matter and antimatter. So what you had then at the very beginning is you had attraction, which I associate with love, and you had nothing. And that love created the universe, if you will, by creating attraction between like stuff, but there is actually nothing there. So that's the Big Bang theory in one way to understand it anyways.
Okay, so you're starting us off up at the top of the scale here, making it intimidating for other people to talk now, Ellen.
I
Everybody's gonna
apologize.
say, well, geez, what can I say after that?
I am very sorry. I won't do it again, Mark.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, I saw David Oak's hand up at some point. I haven't been able to keep up with everybody, but am I right, Dave?
Yes.
I think it was David and then Jack, and then we have some comments as well.
Oh, good.
I had my hand up. David Hooper, my brother-in-law, is here. He wanted to say something,
Oh, please.
but Alan frightened him off. He didn't want to follow Alan.
I was going to be, my response is very basic compared to that, but it was more on the quantum scale, the quantum particles, quarks, bosons, and things like that. So those are the more things that are more physical realities that we've broken down in terms of science at this point.
Yeah.
And I say at this point because we keep going smaller, but for now, that's where we are.
Okay.
Could I just say something?
Yeah.
Well, with science, it understands material reality by discovering a law. And could it be that there's an underlying reality, the sort of the, let's call it the kingdom of laws that are apparently universal? But that's as far as I want to go on that one.
It's starting to sound like archetypes almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's a nice way of phrasing it. That's different. I like it.
Oh.
Okay, Jack, you were going to say something?
Actually, most of the universe is made out of dark matter, according to particle physicists, but we don't know what dark matter is. That's the mass of the substance of the universe.
Okay. And we happen to have,
They've concluded it's there, but they don't know precisely, what it is more other than that. So it's largely unknown. The matter of the universe is largely unknown.
okay. And we happen to fortuitously have a practicing physicist in our midst tonight. I'm curious to see what Sergey has to say about all of this.
I'm not asking big question in my physics, but I do have PhD in physics. Yes. It's a biggish question, and it depends whom you're asking and what you are referring to by the universe. If you're talking about physical universe, then the answer would be like Jack said, that we keep going smaller and smaller, breaking down. Like in the times of Greek philosophers like Democritus, we thought of atom as this like the fundamental block of reality. Then they discovered, okay, in between those blocks there is empty space, and then they started breaking them down. They discovered at beginning of 19th century of the electrons and protons, right? So like the fundamental of the atom is now broken into even smaller things, and then they're breaking it now into quarks. So each electron and each proton consists of that, and then go further, and there's theories where they say that quarks consist of, let's say, vibrating strings, and from the string theory, and you keep going, but I think it's the wrong question.
Okay,
You
fair
can
enough.
keep breaking down, but does it really answer what's fundamental?
Okay,
So Mark, did you see the comments as
There
well?
is never a guarantee in science that behind the corner there will be not another block, and it all depends on the way you look at things too. So, sorry, I can't answer better than this.
well, that you did a nice survey of it, though. I like it. So I'm just looking at the chat. Bill had said carbon. Did you want to say more about that, Bill?
Yes, I think, as Sergey said, depends on the meaning of the words that you're asking to the question about, as well as the perspective from people. But in my view, and I'm not very well educated in these matters, but in my view, the life is, from a scientific understanding, life is based on carbon. At least life as we know it. There may be other forms, but life is based on carbon. Without life, you don't have consciousness. Without consciousness, you can't be aware. If you're not aware, then it doesn't exist.
Okay, I'm going to have things to say about consciousness that will maybe change your perspective on that. But that's in a little while. But it's a good point, though, that you're raising. Now, Suzanne said energy. Does she want to say any more about that?
Well, I know nothing about these matters for sure, but in the beginning was the word, and the word was breath. To form a word, you need breath, and that is energy.
Okay.
Simplistic answer. That's all I got.
Well, I don't know about that. I find it intriguing, actually. I'm noticing that Durham is agreeing with Lisa about love being the basic building block. Did you want to further explain that, Durham? Or
well, I mean, we're looking at a stage which is after when the hadith speaks about our hidden treasure, and I loved you.
True.
So that is the essence, the basic of the physical world. Without that love, we couldn't reach the level of making infrastructure and other things. That's why I think love is the original cause.
okay. That's fully justified as far as I can tell. Okay, well, I don't want to belabor the point, but so as Sergey was saying, leading edge scientists such as Michio Kaku are today excited by their discovery that hidden inside the interiors of quarks, infinitesimal vibrating strings now seem to be responsible for the creation of all things. That's from this book. I don't know if you can see this or not. Let me just take a look and make sure I can. I just got this yesterday. I ordered it 6 weeks ago, hoping to have read it by the time this happened, but I've only gotten a quarter of the way through it. So apologies for the lack of detail. Anyway,
Mark, could I jump in with a comment before you continue?
sure,
About,
certainly.
you know, this question, of course, like Sergey said, it depends what you mean by the universe. It depends if you're talking strictly from a materialistic point of view or a spiritual point of view.
That's right.
You're talking from a spiritual point of view, then of course it's love. That's what Abdu'l-Baha said. Of course, a physicist is not going to give his explanations that way. But if we say, for example, that it all boils down to energy, and Sergey has alluded to this ever shrinking universe where we go into smaller and smaller and particles, and now they're, I don't know if they found it, the Higgs boson, which the so-called God particle.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, if we were able to measure it, I remember Bill Hatcher saying this years ago, and I think it's true. If we had the means to measure it, we could keep going smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller.
True.
But what would we find? We'd still be in some kind of energetic field, right? Which is why I think Abdu'l-Baha says the stuff of the universe is love, because love is a form of energy.
Okay.
So he's giving, in a sense, a scientific definition and a spiritual definition when he says that love is the stuff of the universe. So once again, you know, science and religion go hand in hand. It depends. And it's the same thing if we go the other way from the microcosm to the macrocosm through the telescope and the radio telescope. I mean, once again, if we had the means to measure it, we could go out further and further and further into the galaxies. You know, so it's infinity whichever way you go. And in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, one of the names of God is the Ein Sof, the infinite.
Yep.
You know, anyway, just a little comment I wanted to add there.
Okay. Well, let me continue on.
Do you see that Sergey's hand is up?
Oh, is it? Okay. Last comment. Okay, go ahead, Sergey.
I just wanted to kind of word of caution for this kind of, that's why I was hesitant to go down that route, like down and down, zooming in and more.
Right.
And the example I'd like to bring is the analogy from another field. It's actually bridging with mathematics. I think it was around 18th century. There was a guy, he was a naval officer, and he was in Britain, forgot his name, but he was challenged with the task to measure the coastline of Britain. I'm sure some of you have known this story. And when he measured it, he thought, what if I just he got a number. And then he said, oh, what if I just get the maps, which are a bit with a higher resolution, with the like zooming in a bit more. Oh, that will probably give me a better, so I can get more of those islands and like sticking out points for the land. And he did measure it, and then he discovered that the number is bigger. And then he said, oh, what if I zoom more? And then he discovered that this number just keeps growing. And that's how it was called fractals after all. Like, and it's a very big concept in mathematics and cartoons in particular. But that's what, so the danger, that's why I don't like I'm not in that field of physics, but I think it's the wrong kind of quest when you keep zooming in and in, because the physical reality itself is a surface of something deeper, and the spiritual reality is the inner portion of that. And because it's a surface, the surface, as you can picture it, as a surface of the island, it has infinite, if you zoom in more and more, you'll get larger and larger, in this case, smaller and smaller, but it doesn't necessarily bring you closer to the meaning. What's the fundamental thing?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for your thoughts on that. I think we've sort of opened the door now on some questions that we'll address as we go along sometime tonight, but also in the next few nights. So strings are thus the latest candidate in the long-standing scientific quest for a grand unified theory, or GUT for short. In spite of this enthusiasm, however, it's hard to see how these submicroscopic strings explain the creation of everything. So let's take a look at what Wilbur has to say with this type of material. Come on. I'm going to ask, why is that not opening up? I'm going to ask Jennifer if she wouldn't mind reading number 2 for us.
What would it mean if there were a theory that explained everything? And just what does everything actually mean anyway? Would this new theory in physics explain, say, the meaning of human poetry, or how economics works, or the stages of psychosexual development? Can this new physics explain the currents of ecosystems, or the dynamics of history, or why human wars are so terribly common? From Ken Wilbur.
So from the point of view of ordinary human beings, strings may well end up being an important part of the physical world, perhaps even a fundamental part, but are they really all that significant? Let's take a look at 3. How about Harold for this one?
Could you unmute yourself, Harold? There we go.
Now I can't see it. I'm sorry.
Oh.
Something, yeah, I have trouble on this end.
Okay, are you on a PC or on a tablet or what?
I'm on a computer. If it would only show me. Okay, good. Finally. Yeah, I don't think I'm worth waiting for. All right. Number what? 4, 3.
3.
You and I already know that strings, should they exist, are only a tiny part of the picture. And we know this every time we look around, listen to Bach, make love, are caught transfixed at the sharp crack of thunder, sit rapturous at sunset, contemplate a radiant world that seems made of something so much more than microscopic, one-dimensional, tiny rubber bands. A theory of everything, Wilbur.
So some have said that the new physics shows us the mind of God. If this is true, Wilbur believes that it only applies when God is thinking about dirt. Speaking of dirt, here's another Wilbur zinger on the same topic that I just couldn't resist sharing with you. That's number 4, and I'm going to ask my lovely wife to read that one.
Reading number 4.
Yeah.
The bleakness of the modern scientific proclamation is chilling. In that extraordinary journey from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit, scientific materialism halted the journey at the very first stage and proclaimed all subsequent developments to be nothing but arrangements of frisky dirt. Why this dirt would get right up and eventually start writing poetry was not explained. Or rather, it was explained by dumb chance and dumb selection, as if 2 dumbs would make a Shakespeare.
Frisky dirt is one of my favorite all-time phrases. I don't know about you, but it encapsulates so much. So to my mind, it strains the bounds of credibility to declare that submicroscopic vibrating strings are the cause of everything. In part 3 of this course, we will examine how Wilbur portrays everything presented to us by the cosmos. In his eyes, for a view to be truly integral, it must incorporate all the dimensions left out by the scientific worldview, specifically mind, soul, and spirit. So let's talk about the nature of evolution. Now that we've reviewed Sri Aurobindo's life in some detail in the last two classes, we can begin to appreciate how atypical his perspective is likely to be when compared with those who do not possess his decades of spiritual adventure. With that in mind, let's explore the world as seen through Aurobindo's eyes. One of the most obvious ways Aurobindo's uniqueness becomes apparent relates to his view of evolution. He believes that the scientific community identifies evolution as a process of formation rather than an explanation of our being. Science restricts itself to the physical and biological data of nature, from which it deduces the general law of a quite mysterious and inexplicable energy. It is unable to understand the reasons for its actions. Science focuses its efforts on describing the beginning and ending of evolution because, in Aurobindo's opinion, there is in its acts no fountain of spiritual intention, but only the force of an unresting material necessity. In other words, science concerns itself only with the most external machinery of nature. So Eva, if you're there, could you read number 6 from your outdoor office? I beg your pardon, number 5, sorry.
Unmute yourself, please, Eva.
The science of the West has discovered evolution is a secret of life and its process in this material world. But it has laid more stress on the growth of form and species than on the growth of consciousness. Even consciousness have been regarded as an incident and not the whole secret of meaning of the evolution. Been doing integral yoga.
Thank you. His own point of view diverges significantly from this. So Nina, let's see what number 6 has to say about that.
The way in which man, referring here to himself, sees and experiences the universe imposes on his reason the necessity of a one original eternal substance of which all things are the forms, and one internal original energy of which all movement of action and consequence is the variation. But the whole question is, what is the reality of this substance and what is the essential nature of this energy? Sri Aurobindo.
So through his spiritual practice, he has come to see that this substance and nature are fundamentally spiritual. So what is the basic building block of the universe from Aurobindo's perspective? In a word, consciousness. But not consciousness as science typically understands it. Gila, would you be willing to read number 7 for us, please?
Science sees consciousness only as a phenomenon which emerges out of inconsistent matter and consists of certain reactions of the system to outward things. But that is phenomenon of consciousness. It is not consciousness itself. It is even only a very small part of the possible phenomena of consciousness and can give no clue to the true nature of consciousness, the spiritual reality which is of the very essence of existence.
The spiritual reality, which is the very essence of existence. That's how he conceives of consciousness. So Aurobindo's is a greatly expanded understanding of the word, which extends far beyond our normal conception. As he says, this enlarged understanding is based on his own experience of nirvana following Lile's guidance, if you'll cast your mind back to that description. Okay, so let's see here. How about Durham? This next one, it's a bit long, but it's an important one. Number 8.
One thing before I read.
Oh, sure.
You know, what we read is interesting. One person used to, when people argue about the existence of God, he would say, look, can you prove to us what is in our head? How does it work? If we don't know about how this inside works, exactly what Aurobindo is saying, you know, that consciousness, that we can know that as a phenomena, but what exactly is consciousness? If we cannot prove what is consciousness, how can we prove God, you know? And he used to use this argument. I just thought to share with you.
Very good.
Yeah. So reading number 8. Consciousness is not, to my experience, a phenomena dependent on the reactions of personality to the forces of nature and amounting to no more than a seeing or interpretation of these reactions. If that were so, then when the personality becomes silent and immobile and gives no reactions, as there would be no seeing or interpretive action, there would therefore be no consciousness. That contradicts some of the fundamental experiences of yoga. For example, a silent and immobile consciousness infinitely spread out, not dependent on the personality, but impersonal and universal. Not seeing and interpreting content, but motionlessly self-aware, not dependent on the reactions, but persistent in itself even when no reactions take place. The subjective personality itself is only a formation of consciousness, which is a power inherent not in the activity of the temporary manifested personality, but in the being, the self, or Purusha.
Boy, there's a lot in that statement. So in other words, consciousness does not always make itself known to the outside world. It often chooses to remain a silent witness of events occurring in its surroundings. In addition, what we know as our subjective personality is but one of the forms created by consciousness. Consciousness itself is the capital S self, or the Purusha within us and within everything else. So we've mentioned the term Purusha. It goes hand in hand with another one. So what is this Purusha? As the practice of yoga evolved over the millennia in India, yoga early on became intertwined with Sankhya philosophy. One of Sankhya's central metaphysical concepts is the pairing of Purusha and Prakriti, the Sanskrit terms for soul and nature. This pair is active throughout the entire universe and can be readily detected within our own individual selves. And Margaret is going to show us how that happens. Number 9.
Oh, excellent. Existence is composed of Prakriti and Purusha, the consciousness that sees, Purusha, and the consciousness that executes and formalizes what we see, Prakriti. The one we call soul, the other nature. These are the first double terms from which our yoga has to start. When we come to look in at ourselves instead of out at the world and begin to analyze our subjective experience, we find that there are two parts of our being which can be, to all appearance, entirely separated from each other. One, a consciousness which is still and passive and supports, and the other, a consciousness which is busy and creative and is supported. The passive and fundamental consciousness is the soul, the Purusha, witness, or Saksi. The active and superstructural consciousness is nature, Prakriti, processive or creative energy of the Saksi. But the two seem at first to stand apart and distinct, as if they had no share in each other. Sri Aurobindo, The Hour of God.
So here he's saying there's at least two forms of consciousness inside each of us. So some of you have had, I'm sure, done lots and lots of forms of yoga. And I presume that one of the experiences you've had is to enter the witness consciousness. That's beginning to get towards the soul, which is watching, which appears to be inactive, but in fact isn't. Anyway, I don't want to jump ahead too much. So let's return to Aurobindo's explanation of the nature of consciousness itself. He maintains that the foundation upon which all of creation is built is consciousness, not vibrating strings. Okay.
Mark, before you go on, Jack has his hand up.
Yeah, please go ahead, Jack.
Well, Mark, I just wanted to say that when you stop and think about it, if consciousness is like a force field again, that we don't know exactly what it is, there's again two ways to look at consciousness. You have atheistic materialists like Daniel Dennett saying we're going to explain consciousness strictly in physical terms by chemical reactions in the brain.
Right.
And other people like Keith Ward, the theologian from, I think he's from Oxford and an avowed Christian, you know, who takes the more spiritual point of view that this is something supernatural that will never be able to be explained fully. But I think the forms of consciousness are infinite, because although in our everyday consciousness, we're used to being with ourselves in a certain mode of existence, right? But in the mystical world, there are many different forms of consciousness. So you could look at the way Baha'u'llah talks about the worlds of God in the seven valleys, or, and he says there are no limits on these. So when you think about it really, although we have sort of default positions of consciousness in which we operate, as soon as we transcend or get into what is called paranormal states of mind, we're still conscious, but they change. So my thought on that would be that the forms of consciousness are infinite, and undoubtedly in the next world we're going to experience very different kinds of consciousness, because Baha'u'llah says in the Gleanings, how do you, why would you think you'd have the same consciousness in the next world when the brain, the instrument upon which consciousness depends in this world, will be obliterated? So it obviously won't be the same form of consciousness.
That's a good point. Something to think about.
Mark, Sergey, did you want to say something?
Can I ask Jack one question?
Why not?
Jack, how many manifestations of God are out there?
Once again, Sergey, it's all a question of definition. How are you defining manifestation of God with a capital M or a small m? If it's a small m, they're infinite. Every blade of grass, every grain of sand, every drop of water is a manifestation of God with a small m. It's all zuhur. It's all Zuhur and Tajali.
So did you want to make a point on that, Sergey, or was that what you were hoping to hear?
Well, it's a correct answer, but the point is like what I was more referring to, like the capital M, because we have these manifestations of God. You can look at them as there is multiple of them, but yet they're somehow one. So like you can argue as much as you want that there's this one and that one, but there's this particular consciousness of that one, and you will just be disagreeing with each other, like how many of them or which one is supreme or which one is better. But it's one and the same. Like humans are very good at making multiple things. Like we just, this is what science is good at. This is what our mind are good at breaking things down at smaller and smaller things and like separating them. We're not very good at generalizing.
Yeah, Sergey, that's why the Greeks said the greatest problem of philosophy is the problem of the one and the many. There you go.
That's right. Okay. I kind of lost my way here. Okay, so okay, so Aurobindo is maintaining that the foundation upon which all of creation is built is consciousness, not vibrating strings. And so I was going to turn to Suzanne and ask her to read number 10, if she wouldn't mind.
John, I've lost page 3. There we go. Consciousness is a fundamental thing. It is the fundamental thing in existence. It is the energy, the action, the movement of consciousness that creates the universe and all that is in it. Not only the macrocosm, but the microcosm is nothing but consciousness arranging itself. Sri Aurobindo, Letters on Yoga.
So you were the one who said energy when we asked that question earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there
Yes.
you go. He agrees with you.
Cool.
Nice. Okay, good for you. You got a gold star. It's a single thing capable of creating and assuming any form it wants. Okay, so let's see. How about David Erickson for number 11?
Okay. Consciousness is not composed of parts. It is fundamental to being and itself formulates any parts it chooses to manifest. Developing them from above downward by a progressive coming down from spiritual levels toward the evolution in matter, or formulating them in an upward working in the front by this process that we call evolution. Sri Aurobindo, Letters on Yoga 1.
So what he's doing is giving a snapshot of his entire theory of evolution, actually, where he's talking about consciousness coming down. So this is the arc of descent from spiritual levels towards matter. And then he's also talking about the arc of ascent when he says bringing an upward working in the front by this process that we call evolution. So these two are constantly going on all the time, balancing each other out, actually.
Mark?
Yep. Go ahead, Harold.
Yeah, Mark, I'm wondering if I'm getting a sense that for Aurobindo, consciousness is like formative energy that's not visible, but it's internally discernible, and that Prakriti or nature or matter would be formative energy that is observable.
Oh, that's good.
So, but again, observable and invisible are relative. You know, according to Sergey's analysis, like it goes back and forth, the boundary between visible and invisible. But he seems to be making consciousness a formative energy, right? It can do things and make things and take, and rise up and go down.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway,
that's helpful. Yeah, it's very much true.
Mark, did you see that Sergey had his hand up?
No, sorry, I didn't. I can only see a few people on my
Okay.
screen, unfortunately.
It looks like I can probably just unmute myself and speak in this forum. So I'll probably do it next time. I wanted to ask, so in this reading 11, if I read it, how is consciousness here different from spirit that we use in the Baha'i writings?
Probably not very different at all.
Then doesn't it look to you that we're inventing a new term that everybody would disagree about? Why not just call it spirit?
He will call it that.
But because that just creates extra confusion, because now somebody understands consciousness differently. Then, like, why not just call it spirit? Just have one word instead of now 2, 3 more.
But he's from India, and they have an enormous vocabulary that they've developed over 5 millennia. So he may be trying to make a point in terms that are a little bit more acceptable to a Western audience, consciousness rather than spirit. Because I mean, even when he was alive, religion was dying, and he was aware of that. So he may have decided that it would be a little smarter to use consciousness instead of that term. I don't know. I'm speculating at this point.
Well, Mark, that's what I was going to say, what Sergey said. You know, in the Abrahamic tradition, in the Abrahamic religions, and also I agree with what Harold said. Harold, I think, figured that out pretty well, how he defined that. This would be called spirit. But, you know, Baha'u'llah says in the Valley of Unity that these, you know, Sergey's arguing for a common lexicon of terms, if you like, that we'd all agree on, which is very difficult when we examine all the world's religions, because, you know, Baha'u'llah says in the Valley of Unity that these differences are kind of inherent to temperament, to the human being, all of these different ways of analyzing and looking at the world and so on and so forth, and that we shouldn't really argue about them, is his point, because this diversity of thought is inherent in human analysis, because, you know, these religions have grown up in different cultures with different vocabularies.
Quite true.
A friend has loaned me the 3 volumes of Sri Aurobindo's letters on yoga, and lots of reading there. But I think one of the advantages of studying this man is that, well, he's developed his own vocabulary, of course, which Mark is going to teach us what it is. But also what I like about Aurobindo's writings, and there is no doubt that this man was a prolific genius. It doesn't mean that he was right about everything. He wasn't. But what is advantageous about studying him is that I think he's integrated very well some of the basic Hindu terms through the grill of Western philosophy, which makes them accessible to us, because, you know, these things can get very complicated if we use all of the Sanskrit terms for all of these things. And as you said, Mark, they've developed a very specialized vocabulary in Sanskrit over the centuries that describes all of these inner states, right?
Yep.
So I think what I like about Aurobindo's writing, and he was also, don't forget, a poet, and there's a very different voice in his poetry than there is in his yogic writings. So I think it's very helpful to study him because he's kind of a bridge between East and West. And that's one of the things that we need to look for as Baha'is. He's a bridge between the Occident and the Orient.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Jack. Okay, I have to push on. I'm aware of the fact that we're running out of time already. So forms of consciousness other than ordinary human consciousness may manifest themselves in activities or degrees beyond what we consider normal. And I'd ask Belinda if she would read number 12.
Could you unmute yourself, Belinda?
Okay, number
Thank you.
12. Got it. It will be evident that by consciousness is meant something which is essentially the same throughout all the gradations of consciousness, but variable in status, condition, and operation, in which some grades or conditions, the activities we call consciousness can exist either in a suppressed or an unorganized or a differently organized state. While in other states, some other activities may manifest, which in us are suppressed, unorganized, or latent, or else are less perfectly manifested, less intensive, extended, and powerful than those of higher grades above our highest mental limit.
Ooh.
I think that can be simplified.
I think that could be a little bit simplified, but
Well, he's covering all kinds of possibilities, unfortunately, all at once.
yeah.
So what he's trying to do is to capture somehow the gradations of consciousness, that some of them are sharper than others, more focused. Some of them are more fluid. I mean, if you think about a dream state that you have when you go to sleep at night, it's a different kind of consciousness than the one you're currently operating in right now. And then if you think about what kind of consciousness there is when you're in deep sleep, it's different from a dream state, if you see what I'm saying. Plus, there's also all the variations in terms of people at different ages or in different environments. They think about different things. Right? We're going to go into that in some detail when we come to Wilbur's thinking.
Mark,
Anyway, that's what he's trying to suggest here, that we need to be alive to the fact that consciousness is capable of displaying itself in a huge number of different ways with more or less capacity.
So Mark, Bill has his hand up.
Okay, Bill.
So this particular reading, when I was reading it, maybe I'm on a different planet or something, but it seemed to me that he wasn't necessarily just talking about human consciousness.
Right.
And that when I think about like animals, and I don't know if you ever tried to empathize with an animal and see where their brains are at, or where their minds are at, or whether they have minds.
Good example.
And he's talking about these various levels of organization of consciousness and states of consciousness. And I'm just wondering if that relates to the tradition in the Hindu world with regard to different forms of life that you graduate towards as you increase your consciousness.
Yes, it does.
And I kind of wanted to see what you thought was going on there in that context.
Now, are you referring to the cycle of rebirth? Is that what you're thinking of, or?
Well, that aspect of Hinduism seems to have influenced how he's thinking, or he's thinking about those things that are explained by some of the thinking in the Hindu tradition.
Yeah, they are, and he has a very subtle take on that, which I have consciously stepped away from because I was conscious of the enormity of what I was trying to accomplish. And so I had to say, I can't really investigate what he has to say about rebirth. I know it's there, but I'm feeling that it's not that critical that we understand that in order to be able to figure out what he's talking about with the stages of the soul. But you're quite right. He's talking here in this passage, latent in it is the, as we'll see, there's a whole realm of evolution from straight energy to matter, to plant life, to the animal world, to human beings, and to stages beyond where we currently are that he's referring to here. It's another issue as to whether or not human beings come back here based on their karma. The Baha'i faith is very clear that that doesn't happen. But at the same time, who's to say what kinds of worlds are available to human beings after this world that will have the same function that karma has?
If he's saying that there's one consciousness, but that consciousness exists in different states and different creatures, then he really is saying that the essence of what is human consciousness is present in the kingdom of life.
Yes, but it's quiet. It's not developed. It's not manifested in that situation. I'll be explaining this in a lot more detail, Bill, but honestly, it's a central thrust of what we're doing today. Okay? So consciousness, according to Aurobindo, may choose to make itself visible or it may choose to remain undetected. And that I'm going to ask Alan to read, number 13.
Consciousness is a reality inherent in existence. It is there even when it is not active on the surface, but silent and immobile. It is there even when it is indivisible. Pardon me. It is there even when it is invisible on the surface, not reacting on outward things or sensible to them, but withdrawn and either active or inactive within. It is there even when it seems to us to be quite absent, and the being, to our view, unconscious and inanimate.
So if you happen to be surveying your kingdom and you look at the mountain nearby, that has a consciousness according to Aurobindo. But it's certainly not something that we are aware of. According to him, it's withdrawn, it's inactive on the surface, but it's still there. So I think we have to sort of take him at his word for now and see where he goes with it. No, it's not something we can quickly judge and say, well, there's no way that's true. So as we learned in reading number 11, according to Aurobindo, as the world is being created, consciousness descends from its divine transcendent nature, which is called being consciousness bliss with hyphens between them. The original term is Sat Chit Ananda in Indian thought. This is spirit at its purest and is the parent of both Purusha and Prakriti. Its name identifies three aspects combined into one. Hindu thought makes it clear that these three are not actually separate at this highest point. They're a single unified whole which human language is forced to describe using three different terms. It is only as being consciousness bliss expresses itself on lower levels that these three become unglued or detached from one another. So there is a distinct parallel to Baha'i thinking on this issue, which we touched on when we were in our first part. So all the names of God, for instance, are wrapped up in the primal will. And then as they manifest, then they take on separate, seemingly separate lives and have different effects on the created world. So all this talk about the situations where consciousness is withdrawn, it's dozing, if you like, it's quiet, is called the inconscient, inconscient. So consciousness expresses itself through a series of increasingly limited realms until it reaches the most constrained level of all, the inconscient. So we're talking about the arc of descent. So at the bottom of that descent is the inconscient, where there's no visible consciousness whatsoever. Here consciousness is totally hidden from view. This downward process of what he calls involution results in what Aurobindo calls the inconscient. Here consciousness is entirely veiled. Okay, so number 14 is something that I'm hoping Lori could read for us.
Certainly. Now, Mark, there's two 14s.
Oh my goodness.
Should I read
do
just
that.
the first one?
Yes, please. This should be a 15.
Okay.
It won't change. Anyway.
An involution of the divine existence, the spiritual reality in the apparent inconscience of matter, is the starting point of the evolution. But that reality is in its nature an internal existence. Consciousness, delight of existence. The evolution must then be emergence of this existence. Consciousness, delight of existence, not at first in its essence or totality, but its evolutionary forms that express or disguise it.
So here's his statement about what the basic building block of the universe is: consciousness. It's deeply buried in this thing called the inconscient. And this, by designing his system in this way, he's explaining how it is that life emerges out of seeming nothingness. Mind erupts out of life. Where the hell did that come from? It's because these things are buried away in the very lowest level of of the world, in the inconscient, that they can then bubble up later as the circumstances require.
Mark?
Yes, sir.
Just briefly, Teilhard said something, Teilhard de Chardin, that matter is inspirited.
Yes.
See, that's like saying the same thing, it seems to me. That matter is already spirited, but it's not very active.
Correct.
In some forms of matter. It gets more active later.
Yeah.
Anyway, very parallel, it seems to me.
You're quite right. A lot of people have drawn that conclusion, and I think quite rightly. So this inconscient level consists of the electron and the atom. The infinite capacity of the spirit compresses itself within the tight confines of material nature. Seemingly devoid of all vestiges of consciousness, nature secretly contains the seeds of all forms of consciousness, which will patiently unfold as the process of creation advances over eons and eons. Okie dokie. All right, I guess Heather is not on, is that correct?
That's right, Heather's not here tonight.
Okay, but Ingrid is, so maybe you could read this second number 14 that starts with the spirit.
Spirit which manifests itself here in a body must be involved from the beginning in the whole of matter and in every knot, formation, and particle of matter. life, mind, and whatever is above mind must be latent inactive or concealed active powers in all the operations of material energy.
So I suspect this is probably boring to some people, but this is a really important point that he's raising here. That consciousness that we experience here and in all the higher forms, for instance, that, you know, the Abha kingdom, et cetera, are all found in that inconscient nature at the very bottom of the arc. But there's a process to get from the bottom of the arc up to where we are and then beyond where we are. That's what he's interested in and what I'm interested in. So, hidden in the depths of energy, spirit is not apparent at the beginning of creation, not for millions and millions of years. As Aurobindo understands it, spirit only betrays its presence through a gradually increasing light of self-manifestation over eons. Over time, consciousness creates any and all forms required by its all-consuming, relentless urge to manifest ever more of its full nature. This results in what Wilbur will later describe as a spectrum of consciousness. Step one of evolution consists of the creation of matter out of energy. That's the first major change. Okay, how about Carolyn? Or 16, sorry.
Out of the inconscient, existence appears in the first evolutionary form as substance of matter created by an inconscious energy. Consciousness, involved and non-apparent in matter, first emerges in the disguise of vital vibrations, animate but subconscious, then in imperfect formulations of a conscious knife. It strives towards self-finding through successive forms of that material substance, forms more and more adapted to its own completer expression.
You know, Mark, this is almost perfectly parallel to one of the themes in Abdu'l-Baha's talks.
Which one are you referring to?
Oh, the ones in Promulgation of Universal Peace, for example, or, you know, Curtis Kelsey told us at a fireside that just to illustrate this point, that Abdu'l-Baha was talking to the pilgrims and he struck his foot on a tile on the floor. And he said, this mineral has the potential eventually to attain the station of the human being. I mentioned that in the deepening this morning. And I think he's referring to these coursings, as I think he called them, this journey of what is more inconscient, to use Aurobindo's term, than the mineral? But Abdu'l-Baha said there that eventually that inanimate form could attain the form or be part of the form of the human being through this evolutionary process. The arc of ascent would be, in this case, the arc of ascent. So I think it's very parallel to what Abdu'l-Baha has taught in some of his talks.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it makes me think, as you're talking about the idea that the pebbles are singing as a result of Baha'u'llah being here. Carolyn, go ahead.
Yes, actually this morning we also read in this course about that the essence of essences, the invisible of invisibles, is sanctified above all human speculation, never to be overtaken by the mind of man. And no access can be gained thereunto, as all entry is forbidden there. The utmost one can say is that its existence can be proved, but the conditions of existence are unknown. I find that really interesting. Hmm.
Yeah, it is. Okay, but it's active, right?
Yeah. We recognize that it's there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think we need to take our quick break, Linda, just to